Sino-Burmese War, 1765–69. Published November 7th, 2017. Special characters are denoted as follows. And denotes left and right parentheses. Denotes an M-. The Sino-Burmese War, also known as the Qing Invasions of Burma or the Myanmar Campaign of the Qing Dynasty, was a war fought between the Qing Dynasty of China and the Konbaun Dynasty of Burma. Myanmar. China under the Qianlong Emperor launched 4 invasions of Burma between 1765 and 1769, which were considered as one of his 10 great campaigns. Nonetheless, the war, which claimed the lives of over 70,000 Chinese soldiers and 4 commanders, is sometimes described as the most disastrous frontier war that the Qing dynasty had ever waged, and one that assured Burmese independence. Burma's successful defense laid the foundation for the present-day boundary between the 2 countries. At first, the emperor envisaged an easy war, and sent in only the Green Standard troops stationed in Yunnan. The Qing invasion came as the majority of Burmese forces were deployed in their latest invasion of Siam. Nonetheless, battle-hardened Burmese troops defeated the first 2 invasions of 1765 to 1766 and 1766 to 1767 at the border. The regional conflict now escalated to a major war that involved military maneuvers nationwide in both countries. The Third Invasion, 1767 to 1768, led by the elite Manchu bannermen, nearly succeeded, penetrating deep into central Burma within a few days' march from the capital, Ava. But the bannermen of northern China could not cope with unfamiliar tropical terrains and lethal endemic diseases, and were driven back with heavy losses. After the close call, King Hassan Biaxin redeployed his armies from Siam to the Chinese front. The 4th and largest invasion got bogged down at the frontier. With the Qing forces completely encircled, a truce was reached between the field commanders of the 2 sides in December 1769. The Qing kept a heavy military line-up in the border areas of Yunnan for about 1 decade in an attempt to wage another war while imposing a ban on inter-border trade for 2 decades. The Burmese, too, were preoccupied with the Chinese threat, and kept a series of garrisons along the border. 20 years later, when Burma and China resumed a diplomatic relationship in 1790, the Qing unilaterally viewed the act as Burmese submission, and claimed victory. Ultimately, the main beneficiaries of this war were the Siamese, who reclaimed most of their territories in the next 3 years after having lost their capital Ayutthaya to the Burmese in 1767. Part 1. Background. The long border between Burma and China had long been vaguely defined. The Ming dynasty first conquered Yunnan borderlands between 1380 and 1388, and stamped out local resistance by the mid-1440s. The Burmese control of the Shan states, which covered the present-day Kachin state, Shan state and Kaya state, came in 1557 when King Bayanong of the Taungoo dynasty conquered all of the Shan states. The border was never demarcated in the modern sense, with local Shan Sobwas chiefs at the border regions paying tribute to both sides. The situation turned to China's favor in the 1730s when the king decided to impose a tighter control of Yunnan's border regions, while the Burmese authority largely dissipated with the rapid decline of the Taungoo dynasty. Part 1. Background. Chapter 1. King consolidation of borderlands. 1730s. The Qing attempts for tighter control of the border were initially met with fierce resistance by the local chiefs. In 1732, the Yunnan government's demand of higher taxes led to several Shan revolts at the border. Shan resistance leaders united people by saying, "The lands and water are our properties. We could plow ourselves and eat our own produces. There is not a need to pay tributes to foreign government. In July 1732, a Shan army, mostly consisted of native mountaineers, laid siege to the Qing garrison at Pua for 90 days. The Yunnan government responded with an overwhelming force numbered around 5,000 and lifted the siege. The Qing army pursued further west but could not put down persistent local resistance. Finally, the Qing field commanders changed their tactics by allying with neutral Sorbus, granting Qing titles and powers, including green standard captainships and regional commanderships. To complete the agreements, the third-ranking officer of Yunnan travelled to Simao personally and held a ceremony of allegiance. By the mid-1730s, the Sorbus of the border who used to pay dual tributes were increasingly siding with the more powerful king. By 1735, the year which the Qianlong Emperor ascended the Chinese throne, 10 Sorbus had sided with the king. The annexed border states ranged from Mogaon and Burma in present-day Kachin State to Hasanwi State, Thaini, and Kengtung State, Kaintong, in present-day Shan State to Sipsongpana, Kainyan, in present-day Zhishuangbanadai Autonomous Prefecture, Yunnan. While the Qing were consolidating their hold at the border, the Taungoo dynasty was faced with multiple external raids and internal rebellions and could not take any reciprocal action. Throughout the 1730s, the dynasty faced Meitei raids that reached increasingly deeper parts of Upper Burma. In 1740, the Mon of Lower Burma revolted and founded the restored Han Hawaii Kingdom. By the mid-1740s, the authority of the Burmese king had largely dissipated. In 1752, the Taungoo dynasty was toppled by the forces of restored Han Hawaii which captured Ava. By then, the king control of the former borderlands was unquestioned. In 1752, the emperor issued a manuscript, King Imperial Illustration of Tributaries, saying that all barbarian tribes under his rule must be studied and reported their natures and cultures back to Beijing. Part 1. Background. Chapter 2. Burmese Reassertion. 1750s to the 1760s. In 1752, a new dynasty called Konbaung rose to challenge restored Han Hawaii, and went on to reunite much of the kingdom by 1758. In 1758–59, King Alornpire, the founder of the dynasty, sent an expedition to the farther Shan states, present-day Kachin State and northern and eastern Shan State, which had been annexed by the king over 2 decades earlier, to re-establish Burmese authority. Nearer Shan states had been reacquired since 1754. 3 of the 10 farther Shan state Sorbus, Mogaon, Barmot, Hasenwi, and their militias reportedly ran away into Yunnan and tried to persuade king officials to invade Burma. The nephew of Kengtung Sorbus and his followers also fled. The Yunnan government reported the news to the emperor in 1759, and the king court promptly issued an imperial edict ordering reconquest. At first, the Yunnan officials, who believed that barbarians must be conquered using barbarians, tried to resolve the matter by supporting the defected Sorbus. But the strategy did not work. In 1764, a Burmese army, which was on its way to Siam, was increasing its grip of the borderlands, and the Sorbus complained to China. In response, the emperor appointed Liu Zhao, a respected scholarly minister from the capital, to sort out the matters. At Kunming, Liu assessed that the use of Taishan militias alone was not working, and that he needed to commit regular Green Standard Army troops. Part 2. First Invasion. 1765 to 1766. In early 1765, a 20,000-strong Burmese army stationed at Kengtung, led by General Namai Othihapate, left Kengtung for yet another Burmese invasion of Siam. With the main Burmese army gone, Liu used a few minor trade disputes between local Chinese and Burmese merchants as the excuse to order an invasion of Kengtung in December 1765. The invasion force, which consisted of 3,500 Green Standard troops along with Taishan militias, laid siege to Kentung but could not match battle-hardened Burmese troops at the Kentung garrison, led by General Namai Osifu. The Burmese lifted the siege and pursued the invaders into Pua Prefecture, and defeated them there. Namai Osifu left a reinforced garrison, and returned to Ava in April 1766. Governor Liu, in his embarrassment, first tried to conceal what had happened. When the emperor became suspicious, he ordered Lu's immediate recall and demotion. Instead of complying, Liu committed suicide by slicing his throat with a stationary knife, writing as blood was pouring from his neck, "There is no way to pay back the emperor's favor. I deserve death with my crime." While this kind of suicide in the face of bureaucratic failure apparently was not unusual in King China, it reportedly enraged the emperor nonetheless. Sorting out the the Chinese word for Burmese, was now a matter of imperial prestige. The emperor now appointed Yang Yingju, an experienced frontier officer with long service in Xinjiang and Guangzhou. Part 3. Second Invasion 1766 to 1767. Yang arrived in the summer of 1766 to take command. Unlike Lu's invasion of Kentung, located far away from the Burmese heartland, Yang was determined to strike Upper Burma directly. He reportedly planned to place a king claimant on the Burmese throne. Yang's planned path of invasion was via Bamo and down the Irrawaddy River to Ava. The Burmese knew the route of invasion in advance, and were prepared. Hassan Byashin's plan was to lure the Chinese into Burmese territory, and then surround them. The Burmese commander in the field Balamdin was ordered to give up Bamo, and instead stay at the Burmese stockade at Cornton, a few miles south of Bamo on the Irrawaddy. The Cornton fort had been especially equipped with the cannon corps led by the French gunners, captured at the Battle of Thanlien in 1756. To reinforce them, another army led by Mahathir Thura and posted at the easternmost Burmese garrison at Kenghung, present-day Jinghong, Yunnan, was ordered to march to the Bamo theatre across the northern Shan states. Part 3, Second Invasion, Chapter 1, Trap at Bamo Cornton. As planned, the King troops easily captured Bamo in December 1766 and established a supply base. The Chinese then proceeded to lay siege to the Burmese garrison at Cornton, but Balamdin's defences held off repeated Chinese assaults. Meanwhile, two Burmese armies, one led by Mahasifu and another led by Namai Osifu, surrounded the Chinese. Mahathir Thura's army also arrived and took position near Bamo to block the escape route back to Yunnan. The impasse did not favour the Chinese troops, who were utterly unprepared to fight in the tropical weather of Upper Burma. Thousands of Chinese soldiers reportedly were struck down by cholera, dysentery and malaria. One King report stated that 800 out of 1,000 soldiers in one garrison had died of disease, and that another 100 were ill. With the Chinese army greatly weakened, the Burmese then launched their offensive. First, Namai Osifu easily retook the lightly held Bamo. The main Chinese army was now totally holed up in the Cornton-Bamo corridor, cut off from all supplies. The Burmese then proceeded to attack the main Chinese army from two sides: Balamdin's army out of Cornton Fortress, and Namai Osifu's army from the north. The Chinese retreated eastwards and then northwards, where another Burmese army led by Mahathir Thura was waiting. The two other Burmese armies also followed up, and the Chinese army was destroyed entirely. Mahasifu's army, which had been guarding the western flank of the Irrawaddy, then marched north of Myitkyina and defeated other lightly held Chinese garrisons at the border. The Burmese armies proceeded to occupy 8 Chinese Shan states within Yunnan. Part 3, Second Invasion, Chapter 2, Aftermath. Victorious Burmese armies returned to Ava with the captured guns, muskets and prisoners in early May. At Kunming, Yang began resorting to lies. He reported that Burma had been occupied, that its inhabitants had begun wearing Manchu-style pigtails, and that the Burmese commander, named Sifu, after losing 10,000 men had sued for peace. He recommended that the emperor graciously accept the peace offer to restore the normal trade relations between the two countries. The Qianlong emperor, however, realized the falsity of the report, and ordered Yang back to Beijing. On his arrival, Yang committed suicide at the order of the emperor. Part 4, Third Invasion, 1767 to 1768. Part 4, Third Invasion, Chapter 1, Chinese Mobilization. After the two defeats, the emperor and his court could not comprehend how a relatively small, barbaric country like Burma could resist the might of the king. For the emperor, it was time for the Manchus themselves to come into the picture. He had always doubted the battle-worthiness of his Chinese Green Standard armies. The Manchus saw themselves as a warlike and conquering race and the Chinese as an occupied people. He commissioned a study of the first two invasions, and the report reinforced his biases. That the low battle-worthiness of the Green Standard armies was the reason for the failures. In 1767, the emperor appointed the veteran Manchu commander Ming Ruyi, a son-in-law of his, as governor-general of Yunnan and Guizhou, and head of the Burma campaign. Ming Ruyi had seen battle against the Turks in the northwest and was in command of the strategically key post of Ili, in present-day Kazakhstan. His appointment meant that this was no longer a border dispute but a full-fledged war. Ming Ruyi arrived in Yunnan in April. An invasion force consisting of Mongol and elite Manchu troops rushed down from northern China and Manchuria. Thousands of Green Standards from Yunnan and Taishan militias accompanied this force. Provinces throughout China were mobilized to provide supplies. The total strength of the invasion force was 50,000 men, the vast majority being infantry. The mountains and thick jungles of Burma kept the use of cavalry forces to a minimum. The King Court now seriously considered the threat of illnesses among its troops. As a precaution, the campaign was planned for the winter months when diseases were believed to be less prevalent. Part 4, Third Invasion, Chapter 2, Burmese Mobilization. The Burmese now faced the largest Chinese army yet mobilized against them. Yet King Hassan Biaoshin did not seem to realize the gravity of the situation. Throughout the first two invasions, he had steadfastly refused to recall the main Burmese armies, which had been battling in Laos and Siam since January 1765, and laying siege to the Siamese capital of Ayutthaya since January 1766. Throughout 1767, when the Chinese were mobilizing for their most serious invasion yet, the Burmese was still focused on defeating the Siamese. Even after the Siamese capital was finally captured in April 1767, Hassan Biaoshin kept part of the troops in Siam during the rainy season months in order to mop up the remaining Siamese resistance during the winter months later that year. He actually allowed many Shan and Laotian battalions to demobilize at the start of the rainy season. As a result, when the invasion did come in November 1767, the Burmese defences had not been upgraded to meet a much larger and a more determined foe. The Burmese command looked much like that of the second invasion. Hassan Biaoshin again assigned the same commanders of the second invasion to face off the Chinese. Sifu led the main Burmese army, and was the overall commander of the Chinese theatre, with Thura and Sifu commanding two other Burmese armies. Balamdin again commanded the Cornton fort. Given that the main Burmese army was only about 7,000 strong, the entire Burmese defense at the start of the third invasion was most likely no more than 20,000. Part 4, Third Invasion, Chapter 3, Chinese Offensive. Ming Ruyi planned a two-pronged invasion as soon as the rainy season ended. The main Chinese army, led by Ming Ruyi himself, was to approach Ava through Senwi, Lashio and Hasipur, and down the Namta River. The main invasion route was the same route followed by the Manchu forces a century earlier, chasing the Yongli Emperor of the Southern Ming dynasty. The Second Army, led by General Erdung, was to try the Burma route again. The ultimate objective was for both armies to clamp themselves in a pincer action on the Burmese capital of Ava. The Burmese plan was to hold the Second Chinese Army in the north at Kornton with the army led by Naimyo Sifu, and meet the main Chinese army in the northeast with two armies led by Mahasifu and Mahathir. At first, everything went according to plan for the king. The third invasion began in November 1767 as the smaller Chinese army attacked and occupied Burma. Within 8 days, Ming Rui's main army occupied the Shan states of Senwi and Hasipur. Ming Rui made Senwi a supply base, and assigned 5,000 troops to remain at Senwi and guard the rear. He then led a 15,000-strong army in the direction of Ava. In late December, at the Gotik Gorge, south of Hasipur, the two main armies faced off and the first major battle of the third invasion ensued. Outnumbered 2-1, Mahasitha's main Burmese army was thoroughly routed by Ming Rui's bannermen. Mahathir too was repulsed at Senwi. The news of the disaster at Gotik reached Ava. Hassan Byashin finally realized the gravity of the situation, and urgently recalled Burmese armies from Siam. Having smashed through the main Burmese army, Ming Rui pressed on full steam ahead, overrunning one town after another, and reached Singu on the Aruwai, 30 miles north of Ava at the beginning of 1768. The only bright spot for the Burmese was that the northern invasion force, which was to come down the Aruwai to join up with Ming Rui's main army, had been held off at Kornton. Part 4, Third Invasion, Chapter 4, Burmese Counterattack. At Ava, Hassan Byashin famously did not panic at the prospect of a large Chinese army. About 30,000. At the doorstep, the court urged the king to flee, but he scornfully refused, saying he and his brother princes, sons of a Lawnpire, would fight the Chinese single-handed if they had to. Instead of defending the capital, Hassan Byashin calmly sent an army to take up position outside Singu, personally leading his men toward the front line. It turned out that Ming Rui had overstretched himself and was in no position to proceed any farther. He was now too far away from his main supply base at Senwi, hundreds of miles away in the northern Shan Hills. The Burmese guerrilla attacks on the long supply lines across the jungles of the Shan Hills were seriously hampering the King Army's ability to proceed. Burmese guerrilla operations were directed by General Tying Yamink Haun, a deputy of Mahathir. Ming Rui now resorted to defensive tactics, playing for time to enable the Northern Army to come to his relief. But it was not to be. The Northern Army had suffered heavy casualties in their repeated attacks against the Kornton fort. Its commander, against the express orders of Ming Rui, retreated back to Yunnan. The commander was later publicly shamed and executed on the orders of the emperor. The situation turned worse for Ming Rui. By early 1768, battle-hardened Burmese reinforcements from Siam had been to arrive back. Bolstered by the reinforcements, two Burmese armies led by Mahathir and Naimyo Sifu succeeded in retaking Senwi. The king commander at Senwi committed suicide. The main King Army was now cut off from all supplies. It was now March 1768. Thousands of bannermen from the freezing grasslands along the Russian border began dying of malaria, as well as Burmese attacks in the furnace-like hot weather of central Burma. Ming Rui gave up all hope of proceeding toward Ava, and instead tried to make it back to Yunnan with as many of his soldiers as possible. Chapter 4, Burmese Counterattack. Section 1, Battle of Naimyo. In March 1768, Ming Rui began his retreat, pursued by a Burmese army of 10,000 men and 2,000 cavalry. The Burmese then tried to encircle the Chinese by splitting the army into two. Mahathir Thura had now assumed the overall command, replacing Mahasifu. The smaller army, led by Mahasifu, continued to pursue Ming Rui while the larger army led by Mahathir Thura advanced through the mountainous route to emerge directly behind the Chinese. Through careful maneuvering, the Burmese managed to achieve complete encirclement of the Chinese at modern-day Payinol Win. Maimyo, about 50 miles northeast of Ava. Over the course of 3 days of bloody fighting, the Bannerman army was completely annihilated. The slaughter was such that the Burmese could hardly grip their swords as the hilts were slippery with enemy blood. Of the original 30,000 men of the main army, only 2,500 remained alive and were captured. The rest had been killed either on the battlefield, through disease or through execution after their surrender. Ming Rui himself was severely wounded in battle. Only a small group managed to break through and escaped the carnage. Ming Rui himself could have escaped with that group. Instead, he cut off his queue and sent it to the emperor as a token of his loyalty by those who were escaping. He then hanged himself on a tree. In the end, only a few dozen of the main army returned. Part 5, Fourth Invasion. 1769. Part 5, Fourth Invasion, Chapter 1, Intermission. 1768 to 1769. The Qianlong Emperor had sent Ming Rui and his bannermen assuming an easy victory. He had been making plans about how he would administer his newest territory. For weeks, the king court had heard nothing, and then the news finally came. The emperor was shocked and ordered an immediate halt to all military actions until he could decide what next to do. Generals returning from the front line cautioned that there was no way Burma could be conquered. But there was no real choice but to press on. Imperial prestige was at stake. The emperor turned to one of his most trusted advisers, the chief grand counselor Fuheng, Ming Rui's uncle. Back in the 1750s, Fuheng had been one of the few senior officials who had fully backed the emperor's decision to eliminate the Zhengs at a time when most believed that war was too risky. On the 14th of April 1768, the imperial court announced the death of Ming Rui and the appointment of Fuheng as the new chief commander of the Burma campaign. Manchu generals, Agui, Aligan and Suhid were appointed as his deputies. Now, the top rung of the Qing military establishment prepared for a final showdown with the Burmese. Before any fighting resumed, some on the Chinese side sent out peace feelers to the court of Ava. The Burmese also sent signals that they would like to give diplomacy a chance, given their preoccupations in Siam. But the emperor, with Fuheng's encouragement, made it clear that no compromise with the Burmese could be made. The dignity of the state demanded a full surrender. His aim was to establish direct king rule over all Burmese possessions. Emissaries were sent to Siam and Laotian states informing them of the Chinese ambition and seeking an alliance. Ava now fully expected another major invasion. Hassan Biashin had now brought most of the troops back from Siam to face the Chinese. With the Burmese fully preoccupied with the Chinese threat, the Siamese resistance retook Atayar in 1768 and went on to reconquer all of their territories throughout 1768 and 1769. For the Burmese, their hard-fought gains of the prior 3 years, 1765 to 1767, in Siam had gone to waste, but there was little they could do. The survival of their kingdom was now at stake. Part 5, Fourth Invasion, Chapter 2, Chinese Battle Plan. Fuheng arrived in Yunnan in April 1769 to take command of a 60,000-strong force. He studied past Ming and Mongol expeditions to form his battle plan, which called for a three-pronged invasion via Bamo and the Irrawaddy River. The first army would attack Bamo and Kornton head-on, which he knew would be difficult. But two other larger armies would bypass Kornton and march down the Irrawaddy, one on each bank of the river, to Ava. The twin invading armies on each side of the river would be accompanied by warboats manned by thousands of sailors from the Fujian Navy. To avoid a repeat of Mingrui's mistake, he was determined to guard his supply and communication lines, and advance at a sustainable pace. He avoided an invasion route through the jungles of the Shan Hills so as to minimize the Burmese guerrilla attacks on his supply lines. He also brought in a full regiment of carpenters who would build fortresses and boats along the invasion route. Part 5, 4th Invasion, Chapter 3, Burmese Battle Plan. For the Burmese, the overall objective was to stop the enemy at the border and prevent another Chinese penetration into their heartland. Mahathir Thura was the overall commander, the role which he had assumed since the second half of the third invasion. As usual, Balamdin commanded the Kornton fort. In the last week of September, 3 Burmese armies were dispatched to meet the 3 Chinese armies head-on. A 4th army was organized with the sole purpose of cutting the enemy supply lines. Hassan Biashin had also organized a flotilla of warboats to meet the Chinese warboats. The Burmese defences now included French musketeers and gunners under the command of Pierre Millard, governor of Tabe, who had arrived back from the Siamese theatre. Based on their troop movements, the Burmese knew at least the general direction from where the massive invasion force would come. Mahathir Thura moved upriver by boat toward Bamo. Part 5, 4th Invasion, Chapter 4, Invasion. As the Burmese armies marched north, Fuhen, against the advice of his officers, decided not to wait until the end of the monsoon season. It clearly was a calculated gamble. He had wanted to strike before the Burmese arrived, but he had also hoped that miasma would not be everywhere. So in October 1768, towards the end of, but still during, the monsoon season, Fuhen launched the largest invasion yet. The 3 Chinese armies jointly attacked and captured Bamo. They proceeded south and built a massive fortress near Shweniongbin village, 12 miles east of the Burmese fortress at Kornton. As planned, the carpenters duly built hundreds of warboats to sail down the Aruwai. But almost nothing went according to plan. One army did cross over to the western bank of the Aruwai, as planned, but the commander of that army did not want to march far away from the base. When the Burmese army assigned to guard the west bank approached, the Chinese retreated back to the east bank. Likewise, the army assigned to march down the eastern bank also did not proceed. This left the Chinese flotilla exposed. The Burmese flotilla came up the river and attacked and sank all the Chinese boats. The Chinese armies now converged on attacking Kornton. But for 4 consecutive weeks, the Burmese put up a remarkable defense, withstanding gallant charges by the bannermen to scale the walls. A little over a month into the invasion, the entire Qing invasion force was bogged down at the border. Predictably, many Chinese soldiers and sailors fell ill, and began to die in large numbers. Fuhen himself was struck down by fever. More ominously for the Chinese, the Burmese army sent to cut the enemy line of communication also achieved its purpose, and closed in on the Chinese armies from the rear. By early December, the Chinese forces were completely encircled. The Burmese armies then attacked the Chinese fort at Shweniongbin, which fell after a fierce battle. The fleeing Chinese troops fell back into the pocket near Kornton where other Chinese forces were stationed. The Chinese armies were now trapped inside the corridor between the Shweniongbin and Kornton forts, completely surrounded by rings of Burmese forces. Part 5, 4th Invasion, Chapter 5, Truce. The Chinese command, which had already lost 20,000 men and a quantity of arms and ammunition, now asked for terms. The Burmese staff were averse to granting terms, saying that the Chinese were surrounded like cattle in a pen, they were starving, and in a few days they could be wiped out to a man. But Mahathir Thura, who oversaw the annihilation of Mingrui's army at the Battle of Maimyo in 1768, realized that another wipeout would merely stiffen the resolve of the Chinese government. Mahathir Thura was said to have said, Comrades, unless we make peace, yet another invasion will come. And when we have defeated it, yet another will come. Our nation cannot go on just repelling invasion after invasion of the Chinese, for we have other things to do. Let us stop the slaughter, and let their people and our people live in peace. He pointed out to his commanders that war with the Chinese was quickly becoming a cancer that would finally destroy the nation. Compared to Chinese losses, Burmese losses were light, but considered in proportion to the population, they were heavy. The commanders were not convinced, but Mahathir Thura, on his own responsibility, and without informing the king, demanded that the Chinese agree to the following terms. 1. The Chinese would surrender all the Sobwas and other rebels and fugitives from Burmese justice who had taken shelter in Chinese territory. 2. The Chinese would undertake to respect Burmese sovereignty over those Shan states that had been historically part of Burma. 3. All prisoners of war would be released. 4. The Emperor of China and the King of Burma would resume friendly relations, regularly exchanging embassies bearing letters of goodwill and presents. The Chinese commanders decided to agree to the terms. At Cornton, on the 13th of December 1769. Or the 22nd of December 1769. Under a 7-roofed Pyathat Hall, 14 Burmese and 13 Chinese officers signed a peace treaty. The Chinese burned their boats and melted down their cannon. 2 days later, as the Burmese stood to arms and looked down, starved Chinese soldiers marched sullenly away up the Taping Valley. They began to perish of hunger by thousands in the passes. Part 6. Epilogue. At Beijing, the Qianlong Emperor was not pleased with the treaty. He did not accept the Chinese commander's explanation that the fourth stipulation, exchange of embassies bearing presents, amounted to Burmese submission and tribute. He did not permit the surrender of the Sobwas or other fugitives, nor the resumption of trade between the two countries. At Ava, Hassan Biashin was furious that his generals had acted without his knowledge, and tore up his copy of the treaty. Knowing that the king was angry, the Burmese armies were afraid to return to the capital. In January 1770, they marched to Manipur, where a rebellion had begun, taking advantage of Burmese troubles with the Chinese. After a 3 days battle near Langtharbal, the Meiteis were defeated, and their Raja fled to Assam. The Burmese raised their nominee to the throne, and returned. The king's anger had subsided. After all, they had won victories and preserved his throne. Still, the king sent Mahathir Thura, the decorated general, whose daughter was married to Hassan Biashin's son and heir apparent Singhu, a woman's dress to wear, and exiled him and other generals to the Shan states. He would not allow them to see him. He also exiled ministers who dared to speak on their behalf. Although hostilities ceased, an uneasy truce ensued. None of the points in the treaty was honored by both sides. Because the Chinese did not return the Sobwas, the Burmese did not return the 2,500 Chinese prisoners of war, who were resettled. The king had lost some of the generation's most important frontier experts, including Yang Yingju, Ming Rui, Aligan, and Faheng, who eventually died of malaria in 1770. The war cost the king treasury 9.8 million silver taels. Nonetheless, the emperor kept a heavy military line-up in the border areas of Yunnan for about 1 decade in an attempt to wage another war while imposing a ban on inter-border trade for 2 decades. The Burmese for years were preoccupied with another impending invasion by the Chinese, and kept a series of garrisons along the border. The high casualties of the war, in terms of the population size, and the ongoing need to guard the northern borders seriously hampered the Burmese military's capability to renew warfare in Siam. It would be another 5 years when the Burmese sent another invasion force to Siam. It would be another 20 years when Burma and China resumed a diplomatic relationship in 1790. The resumption was brokered by the Taish and nobles and Yunnan officials who wanted to see trade resume. To the Burmese, then under King Bodopaya, The resumption was on equal terms, and they considered the exchange of presents as part of diplomatic etiquette, not as tribute. To the Chinese, however, all of these diplomatic missions were considered as tributary missions. The emperor viewed the resumption of relations as Burmese submission, and unilaterally claimed victory and included the Burma campaign in his list of 10 great campaigns. Part 7. Significance. Part 7. Significance. Chapter 1. Territorial changes. Burma's successful defense laid the foundation for the present-day boundary between the two countries. The border still was not demarcated, and the borderlands were still overlapping spheres of influence. After the war, Burma remained in possession of Koshanpi, the 9 states above Bhamo, at least down to the eve of the First Anglo-Burmese War in 1824. The Burmese exerted authority over the southern Yunnan borderlands, as far as Kenhung, present-day Jinghong, Yunnan. Likewise, the Chinese exercised a degree of control over the borderlands, including present-day northeastern Kachin state. Overall, the Burmese were able to push back the line of control up to one that existed before the Qing consolidation drive of the 1730s. However, the war also forced the Burmese to withdraw from Siam. Their victory over the Qing is described as a moral victory. Historian G.E. Harvey writes, "Their other victories were over states on their own level such as Siam. This was won over an empire. A long-pious crusade against the Mons was stained with treachery. The Great Siege of Ayutthaya was a magnificent dacoity, though he described the Sino-Burmese War, a righteous war of defense against the invader." Part 7. Significance. Chapter 2. Geopolitical. The main beneficiaries of the war were the Siamese, who took full advantage of the Burmese absence to reclaim their lost territories and independence. By 1770, they had reconquered most of the pre-1765 territories. Only Tenasserim remained in Burmese hands. Preoccupied by the Chinese threat, and recovering from the depletion of manpower from the war, Hassan Byashin left Siam alone even as Siam continued to consolidate its gains. He was finally forced to send Burmese armies to Siam in 1775 in response to a Siamese-backed rebellion in Land Na a year earlier. In the following decades, Siam would become a power in its own right, swallowing up Land Na, Laotian states, and parts of Cambodia. From a wider geopolitical standpoint, the king, and the Qianlong emperor, who hitherto had never faced defeat, now had to accept, albeit grudgingly, that there were limits to king power. A historian of Chinese military history, Marvin Whiting, writes that the Burmese success probably saved the independence of other states in Southeast Asia. Part 7. Significance. Chapter 3. Military. For the king, the war highlighted limits to their military power. The emperor blamed the low battle-worthiness of his Green Standard armies for the first 2 failed invasions. But he was to concede later that his Manchu banner men were less suited to fighting in Burma than in Xinjiang. Despite sending in 50,000 and 60,000 troops in the last 2 invasions, the Qing command lacked up-to-date information about invasion routes, and had to consult centuries-old maps to form their battle plan. This unfamiliarity exposed their supply and communication lines to repeated Burmese attacks, and allowed their main armies to be encircled in the last 3 invasions. The Burmese scorched earth policy meant that the Chinese were vulnerable to supply line cuts. Perhaps most importantly, the king's soldiers proved ill-suited to fight in the tropical climate of Burma. In the last 3 invasions, thousands of Chinese troops became ill with malaria and other tropical diseases, and many perished as a result. This neutralized the Chinese advantage of superior numbers, and allowed the Burmese to engage the Chinese armies head-to-head towards the end of the campaigns. The war is considered the peak of compound military power. Historian Victor Lieberman writes, "These near-simultaneous victories over Siam 1767, and China 1765 to 1769, testified to a truly astonishing elan unmatched since Bayonne. The Burmese military proved that they were able and willing to take on a far superior enemy, using their familiarity with the terrain and the weather to their maximum advantage. The Battle of Maimyo is now a military case study of infantry fighting against a larger army. Yet it proved that there were limits to the Burmese military power. The Burmese learned that they could not fight two simultaneous wars, especially if one of them was against the world's largest military. Hassan Byushin's reckless decision to fight a two-front war nearly cost the kingdom its independence. Moreover, their losses, while smaller than King losses, were heavy in proportion to her much smaller size of population, hampering their military capability elsewhere. Konbaung's military power would plateau in the following decades. It made no progress against Siam. Its later conquests came only against smaller kingdoms to the west. Arakan, Manipur and Assam. This recording is a derivative work from Wikipedia. For more information, please visit www.frogcast.org.